Hello, world history students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have your notes for Chapter 31, Section 2, Post-Colonial Africa. In number 1, in the 1970s, a coalition of African nations and other countries voted to deny South Africa a seat in the United Nations General Assembly. The General Assembly is kind of like a big Congress of world nations. Many nations, including the United States, refused to trade with South Africa. And in the late 1970s into the beginning of the 1980s, we pretty much had a well-established boycott of South Africa because of the whole issue of apartheid. The ANC, or the African National Council, was formed in 1912. And it was a reform movement led by lawyers who encouraged the use of civil disobedience, primarily civil disobedience against the white government. By the 1960s, the white government of South Africa pretty much had labeled the ANC as a radical group, kind of a militant group, maybe even a terroristic group. And one of their leaders, a man named Nelson Mandela, would eventually be imprisoned, and he would be held in prison for a quarter of a century. So the Soweto uprising, this was an event that sparked a lot of new policies that required Black students to be taught in the language of Afrikaans. And some of these students obviously went out to protest and were literally plowed over by the South African government and their police. As you can see below, there's a picture of a young boy who has been injured as a result of this uprising. And this was a series of many demonstrations that would be sparked because of some of the tightening of the laws in South Africa. In number 4, a man named Stephen Biko. He was a Black protester who fought against apartheid. He would eventually be captured and killed by white policemen. He had actually been labeled banned, which basically means that his movements were restricted. He could not speak publicly, could not be broadcasted on radios or to have his works published in newspapers. Basically, he was being silenced by the South African government. And he made quite a few, I guess you could say, surprise appearances. Even though he was kind of under house arrest, he would find ways to sneak out and to speak to large gatherings of other Black Africans. And eventually he's going to be captured. And his death would be ruled kind of an accident. Truth is, he was tortured and brutally murdered by the authorities. His death made him a martyr among Black Africans. And this brought a lot of attention because of the fact that he had developed a friendship with some white journalists, and his story of his life and death would eventually be published into a book that would be published outside of South Africa, gaining a lot of attention towards what apartheid was and the evils of it. Another man who fought to kind of end apartheid was a spiritual man, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who was one of the higher ranking leaders of the South African Anglican Church. He called for nonviolence and interracial reconciliation, and eventually he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1984. In 1983, Asian and coloreds were given representation in the South African government's 3-house party system. Whites still controlled the majority of the government. Nelson Mandela, who I mentioned a moment ago, who was a member of the ANC, and he had been imprisoned for about a quarter of a century, was released from jail in 1987. He had actually been held in a prison off the coast of Africa known as Robben's Jail. And some people had thought that he had perished years before, but there had been an occasional story that would be released and noting that he was still alive. And, a lot of people were kind of surprised that he actually was still alive when the 1980s, late 1980s rolled around. But in 1987, F.W. de Klerk and the government kind of pushed for his release, and eventually he would be released. F.W. de Klerk, who was the white leader of South Africa, he helped to end apartheid by releasing Mandela from prison and reinstated the African National Council, or the ANC, um, allowing them to be one of the first non racial elections, and to allow the ANC to be a political party in the early 1990s. And what eventually ends up happening is when we have these free elections, Mandela is going to be elected president of South Africa. Other events going on in Africa. We had the genocide that occurred in 1994 in the country of Rwanda. That was a result of the Hutu led government encouraging the destruction of the Tutsis and the moderate Hutus. Um, for years, these were people that were tribal people. Eventually, as Europeans come in, um, you know, distinctively, they are going to be kind of put into different classes. And by the time we get to the beginning of the 1990s, the Hutus were in control of the government and decided that the Tutsis were their rivals, and went after them, and those people who kind of sided with the Tutsis, who were Hutu. And eventually we have a mass killing of people in Rwanda, to the point where, if you take a look at the photo below, we have a mass migration of people out of the region because of the fear that they had during the year of 1994. So certainly there has been other wars. You could talk about a series of wars that happened in Sudan, and the birth of the nation of Southern Sudan, and the ongoing turmoil that's still happening in that part of the world. There's still political instability, and I don't think that's anything that's new here. Anyway, number 4, many dictatorships in Africa were weakened following the Cold War because of the lack of funding from the United States and also the Soviet Union. And other countries that previously had given money to dictators who were on their side. Since independence, Africa has had a face of environmental challenges. Desertification has spread desert-like conditions in certain parts of the northern part of Africa. It also contributes to things like droughts and famines. During the 1980s, there was widespread famine in places like Ethiopia. And there's always been concern in places like Somalia about whether or not enough food is out there for the remaining part of the civilization. We also had problems with disease. The spread of HIV and AIDS is another challenge faced by African nations. Only a small percentage of Africans with AIDS do receive treatment due to a lack of education, a lack of infrastructure to deliver treatment, and primarily a lack of money to pay for expensive treatments. The Gates Foundation, founded by Microsoft founder Gates, has spent a lot of money in finding research and medication to be funded in South Africa and throughout Africa in general. Thank you very much.